What lessons from mid-century labor organizing can be applied to today's efforts to unionize logistic giants? Maybe we should start off with kind of getting into how big these companies are. How did the spatial concentration of manufacturing plants create opportunities for successful unionization in the past? And how does that differ today? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about strategic choke point analysis and targeting, you tend to think of the CIO era. It's the one reliable referent, I guess you could say, for a real labor upsurge in America, something that changed the coordinates of politics in the United States. That being said, I think a lot of people are pretty reticent to apply the lessons of the CIO era, just given how much the economy has changed.
Mhm.
We've deindustrialized. Working class communities tend to be much more diffused and atomized than they were in the 1930s. And so there are a lot of organizing obstacles, you could say. And just to sort of paint the picture, 1930s, the big targets were, the US steel plants, the big auto plants, the General Electric and Westinghouse plants. And these were manufacturing factories where you had thousands of workers all working in the same place alongside one another, and then living fairly close to the factory as well. And so you had not just workplace concentration, you had working class community concentration as well. And so, despite the fact that there were all sorts of hurdles and obstacles to organizing, it was ripe terrain for labor organizing as well. Contrast that with the present, where even in large employment clusters, you don't see the same kind of spatial density in the workplace. And working class communities are much more diffuse than they were in the 1930s. And so you get people driving an hour and a half to work, living very far away from the place where they work. And in those conditions, it's really difficult to apply the CIO lessons to the present. But I think you laid it out pretty well in the intro, actually, like why we think that moment still matters for the present, and that the basic lesson is target the big employers and try to disrupt their operations until they come to the bargaining table. It seems like an obvious lesson in one sense, but it's a radical one as well.
Isn't it a little harder to do now, though? Disrupt those operations, Scott?
So, I mean, the focus on disruptive capacity is really key in any organizing context. I mean, one thing that I think is a caveat I'd take with sort of contrasting big manufacturing mid-century to logistics in the present is that the distribution systems have always been a huge part of the economy. They've always been a huge part of labor organizing and asserting power. Um, you know, these were largely ignored by economists. There weren't even many metrics for factoring and transportation costs until the 1960s. But at this point, the distribution networks you're dealing with have a mix of concentration and dispersion. So it depends the level you're looking at. In some cases, you're seeing location choices that are being made on a very different set of factors than manufacturing would have been. You have a very traditional problem with manufacturing where you focus on sites where you can control labor costs, input costs of resources, and transportation costs. So you end up with large industry clusters in a single area. That changes a lot when you build out all of the infrastructure required for a modern distribution network, primarily the highway networks, the rail networks, the air hubs. And it means that those locational decisions aren't as relevant anymore. So it disperses the location of the workforce and creates challenges with that kind of traditional targeting.
Just to add one small thing, there's an idea that the Amazons of the world, the Walmarts of the world, are kind of impenetrable, or at least that their operations are so sophisticated and they've built in such redundancy to all of their distribution networks that it's impossible to disrupt them as CIO organizers were able to disrupt the big manufacturers, right? And I think that there's definitely some truth there insofar as it was much more obvious in the 1930s, right? Like the famous sit down strike at GM the key moment came when workers realized that they could seize the motor plant, Chevy plant number 4, and that kind of ended the strike, right? Once like GM could no longer make motors, they realized they needed to come to the table. There's nothing like Chevy plant number 4 in any of the distribution networks that we look at. That being said, there are other vulnerabilities, and this idea that, I mean, again, that Amazon is somehow invincible, I think it's just not true. Like, if you look at the differentiated aspects of their distribution network, there are parts where labor organizing could have a big effect. There are other parts where they have built in that redundancy and where it wouldn't make sense to focus. But this is all to say that it's more complicated today, and that's one of the reasons why we started the Substack, to try to understand these very sophisticated logistical operations with the hope of finding the weaknesses, or what historian John Womack calls the seams in their operations.
What kind of so I know you said that last line, that's where you guys started it, but I mean, how did you guys even know to look into logistics? Did you already know about the logistics of some of these plants?
So this is not like a novel idea. I think there's been a lot of focus from labor scholars from the 70s and 80s onwards who look at the logistics industry as a site of strategic organizing, particularly as global trade and trade that is of intermediate goods through multinational corporations just takes off. Just the numbers start skyrocketing. So transportation becomes a very key part of the process of getting goods to market. I think what's changed now and has brought this even more home and made it even more important in the past 10 years has been the massive rise of what we call distributional retail, following a very excellent transport geographer named Jean-Paul Rodrigue, e-commerce home delivery. But the term distributional retail is really a much better one because it captures the actual work process that goes into this. This is the rise of home delivery of retail goods. And this is so transformative. The sizes of these markets are so massive, the workforces are so large, the firm strategy, the location strategy, responses to be competitive in this environment are so different that it really just intensifies that focus that was already there on logistics for many scholars. I will say also, Ben mentioned a labor historian, Jack Womack from Harvard. There's a really excellent collection of interviews with him and responses that we had read together a couple years back when it came out. And this sort of inspired us to look more closely at not just the kind of big picture theoretical numbers of logistics system and distribution networks, but to actually do what Womack calls grubbing analysis, which is just a great term that he comes up with, or he might adapt it from maybe John Dunlop, who was a labor relations scholar in the mid-century. What he means is like really getting into the process and figuring out, wait, like how does the package get from one place to another? How does it proceed through a facility? And really trying to understand distribution networks, not as these like opaque monsters that we have to use like this kind of elaborate theoretical vocabulary of flows to describe, but very literal operations where we're seeing the movement of goods like to the final destination, home delivery in the instance of distributional retail.